Good morning. After a difficult year of revolving closures, our children need a real education recovery that makes sure no students fall between the cracks. That means providing students with mental health supports, special education supports, and more individual focus in class. As a retired principal, I know it's going to be a huge challenge to get students back on track. In Huron-Bruce, we have students who've stopped attending virtual classes altogether, and we have parents who've been overwhelmed by the responsibility of ensuring their children are engaged in online learning while working from home. We also have families who've not been able to access reliable internet, a real challenge in our rural riding. Our education workers need to be supported, and we need to make sure that in person learning is here to stay. We know for a fact investing in children now will reap benefits for decades to come. A real education recovery will help drive a strong economic recovery. Every dollar we invest in education returns $1.30 to the economy. That means investing in education now is investing in a strong economy tomorrow. I'm excited to welcome the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, Stephen Del Duca, to discuss our education recovery plan. Stephen, I'll pass it on to you.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much, Shelley. It is great to see you, albeit virtually, of course, through my computer screen this morning. And I'm delighted to join you again virtually in lovely Huron-Bruce. You heard it from Shelley in her own remarks. She is a retired principal. She's been on the front lines in publicly funded education. She has seen firsthand what works and what doesn't work. And I am absolutely thrilled that Shelley has stepped forward and is running for the Ontario Liberal Party in Huron-Bruce. She knows the community. She knows what hardworking families in Huron-Bruce are looking for. And Shelley, you will be a great champion for the communities of Huron-Bruce at Queen's Park after the next election. I know how hard you and your team are already working, although you've only been nominated now for not that long, but I know that you've been jumping right into this and working really, really hard. And I'm very much looking forward to being physically back in Huron-Bruce in the not too distant future. So Shelley said in her opening, and she's 100% right about everything that she mentioned with respect to how difficult the past, well, more than a year now has been on everybody who is related directly or even indirectly to publicly funded education right across Ontario, because of course the pandemic has disrupted everything. I'm here to tell you as a dad whose two daughters, one is in grade 8, one is in grade 4 in publicly funded education, that the way that the current Doug Ford government has approached publicly funded education, both in the run-up to the pandemic and during the pandemic, has made a tough situation dramatically worse for all of us. The whipsaw effect, the lack of clarity, the lack of certainty, the real deeply felt anxiety that moms and dads right across Huron-Bruce and beyond have felt about whether it's safe to send their kids back because there wasn't sufficient physical distancing, because there wasn't sufficient PPE or testing or contact tracing, and because too many of our schools right around Ontario, including on Huron-Bruce, are not physically kept into a state of good repair. So Ontario Liberals, Shelley included, have worked hard over the last number of weeks to come up with a comprehensive and a thoughtful plan that we have put forward publicly about what it's going to take to make sure that for this coming September, my daughters and the 2 million kids that attend publicly funded schools across Ontario have a safe start to the school year so that they can excel, so that they are set up for success. The plan is detailed. There's lots of information in it, but I want to highlight a few of the items that I know will be particularly important to moms and dads, to the students themselves, to teachers, and everyone else who works on the front lines in publicly funded education. First of all, because this past year has been so difficult, I think, and we're only a few days away from the end of the school year, I think it's so important for the government to be focused right now on doing everything it can to make sure that this coming summer break is as good and as healthy and as, I'll say, fun for the kids right across Ontario as possible. Recreational programming, summer camps, all of it. We just need our students, our kids, to be able to get outdoors, enjoy fresh air, enjoy one another's company, and learn what it's like to be a kid again, or remember what it's like to be a kid again, because it has been so tough and there's been so much that they've had to go through over this past year. But we also know that there are tens of thousands of Ontario families that don't have access necessarily to summer programming, summer camps, recreation programs, or they can't afford it. So the Ontario Liberal Plan for Education Recovery has set aside a significant investment to help those families who wouldn't otherwise be able to access this kind of programming, to give them the support so that they can. I've also said from the very beginning, and I'm talking about spring 2020, summer 2020, that the best way to make sure that we are prepared for schools, and I said this in advance of last school year starting, is to make sure that the government, that the Premier himself is engaged in a meaningful and authentic discussion and dialogue with those who represent everybody who works on the front lines in education. I've had the honor of participating in 6 or 7, I think it's now 7, virtual, I'll call them partner calls, Zoom calls, where everybody, people who represent principals, Shelley mentioned she's a retired principal, people who represent school bus drivers, who represent custodians, support staff, teachers, ECEs, everybody's been on the call. Some of those calls, there are 50 or 60 people who've joined us. The school boards are represented. And here's the thing about each one of those Zoom chats. Every single person who comes on the call is wanting to be helpful. They are wanting to give advice about what will work. From a healthcare perspective during a pandemic, they know how important it is to get it right. But translating that so that it will effectively work inside our schools across Ontario is something that we should be relying upon those who have direct expertise to provide that guidance. And so the second thing that I want to stress from our plan is that meaningful discussion, that meaningful partnership needs to be restarted, needs to be taken up by the current government, so that by the time we get to September, we're not confused, we're not flailing, there's a lack of information like we saw last year, so that we're all in this together, because in fact, of course, we are. One of the other cornerstones or foundational elements of our education recovery plan is that we believe it's important to cap class sizes at 20 across the board. So 20 kids per class, no more than that right across the board. And the reason that's really important, of course, is because with the learning gaps that we know have emerged because the pandemic has been so tough, learning gaps that we still need to assess and analyze, we know that giving students as much direct instruction from their teacher and others who support them in the classroom is so important. So class size is capped at 20. We also know that there are thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of students that have special needs across Ontario. And we know that heading into the pandemic, they were not getting the support and the instruction and the care that they needed. So the Ontario Liberal Plan for Education Recovery calls for an investment that will help deliver 5,000 new special education professionals. That's more than one new special education professional per school in Ontario, to help those children who have those special needs thrive, to set them up for success as well. Attached to that, of course, and we've talked about this now for many, many weeks, everybody in Ontario knows this pandemic has had an absolutely disastrous impact on people's mental health. Well, our kids in schools and frontline education workers have not been immune to that challenge. And so our plan also calls for an investment that will see 1,000 new mental health professionals brought into the system, so that kind of support can be there for our kids and for those who work in publicly funded education right across the board. The last thing that I'm going to point to is the notion of ventilation. Now, I've had the chance to chat with a variety of advocacy organizations on this particular topic, including one that's called Fix Our Schools. They're doing really phenomenal work right across Ontario. This is one of the reasons that a number of weeks ago, I called on Doug Ford to cancel the wasteful and reckless Highway 413 and instead invest $8 billion over 4 years, over 5 years, I should say, to make sure that Ontario schools are in the best shape they can be in. But at the same time, it's so important for the current provincial government. And this is what I'd be doing if I'd had the chance to lead this province at this moment in time, to match the federal investment so that school ventilation, better windows, all of the work that's required to make sure that our kids' classrooms are physically safe and physically healthy for them can be undertaken urgently over the summer months. So these are some of the things that are included in the Ontario Liberal Plan for Education Recovery. There is one more, I'll call it, overarching theme that's so important to me as a dad. And that is, and Shelley touched upon it at the outset, nothing is better for our kids and for the publicly funded education system than in-person learning. When our kids are safe and healthy, when the professionals who work in our schools, from teachers to caretakers to ECEs to principals, are fully supported and respected and motivated to do the work that I know they want to do. And so this notion that Doug Ford has created, that somehow there should be an ongoing, never-ending, parallel online publicly funded system, is not something that I support, not just as a politician, but I don't support that as a dad. I know moms and dads for this school year, because the pandemic is not yet fully in the rearview mirror, will have some anxiety and they'll want an online or virtual option. And I get that. And our plan takes that into account. But once we have, thanks to everybody's sacrifice and hard work, once the pandemic is beyond us or behind us, we need to make sure that we collectively have built the strongest, most resilient in-person publicly funded education system, so our kids are set up for success and can thrive. That's good for Ontario's kids. That's good for Ontario's hardworking families. It's certainly good for our economy, and it's good for all of us. And so this is what the Ontario Liberal Plan for Education Recovery envisions for the coming weeks, the coming months, and the coming years. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Okay, just a reminder to the reporters on the line, if you have a question, please raise your hand using the Zoom function or write to the chat and I will call on you. And the first question is Steve Paikin from TVO.
Thank you very much, Will. Stephen, I'm just wondering, at what point, or have you set a date on the calendar when you will actually be out there as opposed to in your living room?
Was that because you heard one of my dogs bark again, Steve? Was that you don't like my living room setting? We are looking at probably midway through July, so second or third week of July, from what I understand right now. And as much as I love my living room and I love being close to my kids and my wife and my dogs, I think they're quite keen to get me back out on the road. And I'm very much looking forward to being back on the road, including physically back in Huron, Bruce, as soon as possible. So my expectation is roughly midway through July.
Okay, and my follow-up is for Shelley. Shelley, I don't have to tell you, you're seeking a riding that is not what one thinks of as a classic Liberal riding. So a two-part question: why are you running, and why you're running there?
Well, I thank you for the question, Steve. I'm really running because I think it's time for a change. I know that we have had a conservative riding for 11 years now, but I don't believe that we've really been represented well in Huron Bruce in Queen's Park. And so I really plan to be a strong advocate for Huron Bruce and for our unique riding. We're farms, we're small towns, we're hamlets, we're a beautiful tourist area, and we have a lot to offer. And I don't think our needs have been met. In rural Ontario, we have a lack of access to services, Steve, and we have a lack of access to internet, transportation. There are a lot of issues that need to be addressed here in Huron Bruce that have not been. So my background as an educator, I've been in education for 38 years. I've been a volunteer, particularly with the United Way, with projects helping our most vulnerable citizens. So I feel I know my community. I love my community. I raised my kids here. I live on a little farm. And I think that I will be a great asset to Huron Bruce at Queen's Park.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions on the line. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.